It was an ordinary day that suddenly turned into a real nightmare. A police car crashed into a fence at high speed and burst into flames. People around were in a panic. No one dared to approach. But one person, a black man, without thinking, threw himself into the flames to save the life of a white police officer. He risked everything, not knowing what it would mean for himself. Now imagine the next day he receives a call that will change his life forever. What do you think happened next? Stay with us and you will find out the continuation of this incredible story. Write in the comments where you were watching us from and what would you do in our hero's place. The morning after rescuing the officer, Jason, the hero of that night, woke up early. The events of the previous day haunted him, the flames, the screams, the weight of a lifeless body on his shoulders as he pulled the officer from the burning car. He wasn't looking for glory, he wasn't expecting gratitude, he was simply doing what he thought was right. However, by midday, an unexpected call came. The voice on the other end of the line was formal and stern. It was the city's police chief. He thanked Jason for his courage and said that the officer he had saved was in the hospital and, fortunately, his life was out of danger. But then the voice changed slightly, becoming cold and formal. "Jason," the chief began, "I have something important to tell you. Yesterday's incident came to our attention not only because of your heroism. We investigated the accident and discovered something shocking. The officer you saved was wanted. He fled the scene." Jason was stunned. A wanted officer? He couldn't believe his ears. "How is this possible?" he asked quietly. The police chief sighed and continued. "He was involved in a major drug-related corruption scandal. He was trying to escape yesterday before the accident after he was exposed. Your saving him changed the situation. He is currently under 24-hour guard and we are investigating." Jason sat back in his chair, unsure of what to say. He had risked his life to save a man who turned out to be a criminal. It all seemed so unreal, but the most unexpected thing happened later. A few hours after the call, a car pulled up to Jason's house. It was the same officer he had saved. He was under guard and accompanied by 2 other officers, but his face expressed more than just gratitude. A strong sense of guilt and regret was written in his eyes. "I must tell you," the officer began in a trembling voice. "I knew they were coming for me. I knew everything had collapsed, and I didn't want help from anyone. When your hand pulled me out of the fire, I thought I didn't deserve it. But you did it. Now I'm ready to pay for everything." He paused for a moment, then added, "Your action not only saved my life, but also made me look at everything differently. I am ready to admit my mistakes. And when this is over, if I get a second chance, I will owe it to you." Jason, who had been listening to him in silence, only nodded. He couldn't understand if he had done the right thing, but he knew one thing: when he saved lives, he didn't divide people into good or bad. A few weeks had passed since that fateful day when Jason had saved a police officer from a burning car. His life was slowly returning to normal, but something inside him had changed. That call from the police chief and the subsequent meeting with the officer had left a strange, oppressive feeling. Jason tried not to think about the fact that he had saved a criminal, but the thought gnawed at him inside. One evening, when Jason returned home after a long day at work, his phone rang again. He didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, but the voice on the other end of the line was unfamiliar and alarmed. "Jason, this is Officer Carlisle's sister," the woman said quietly, barely holding back tears. "I need to tell you something. Officer Carlisle, the man Jason saved, died unexpectedly in prison. The official version was suicide, but his sister didn't believe it. She claimed that his death was not accidental. Before his death, Carlisle managed to tell her something, that he would be eliminated by his own people if he started telling the truth." Jason was speechless. He couldn't believe that the man he'd pulled from the fire would turn up dead just weeks later. Everything that had happened since the crash seemed increasingly confusing. Carlisle's sister said that in the days before he died, he had become more open, talking about how he wanted to make things right, about the corruption he'd been involved in that turned out to be covered up by high-ranking officials. He knew he was in danger, but he was willing to go the distance. Now the man was dead, and Jason felt guilty, as if it was his act, his heroism, that had led Carlisle to this tragedy. If he hadn't pulled him out of the car, maybe things would have ended differently. Several days passed. Jason thought more and more about what had happened, until one day the same woman, Carlisle's sister, showed up on his doorstep. She was heartbroken, but her eyes were shining with determination. "I need your help, Jason," she began, her voice barely able to shake. "I can't accept that my brother died for nothing. I don't know who else to trust. He said he trusted you after you saved him. If he trusted you, then I should too." She revealed to Jason the documents Carlisle had given her before his death. They were reports, phone records, and evidence pointing to high-ranking police and local officials who were involved in the corruption scheme. Carlisle was just a small part of it, but by choosing to step aside and tell the truth, he had signed his own death warrant. Jason was stunned. He never thought his life would change so much after that incident. He didn't want to be a part of it, didn't want to risk it again, but as soon as he looked into the eyes of this woman, full of grief and despair, he knew there was no turning back. One night, while walking home, Jason noticed that a car was following him. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, but when it showed up again the next day, fear overwhelmed him. He knew the threat was real. At that moment, his phone rang again. An unknown number appeared on the screen. "If you want to live, don't bother," said the hoarse voice on the other end. "You've already done your job. Don't make us come for you." That call left Jason terrified. He began to realize that he had fallen into a trap from which he could not easily escape. Those behind Carlisle's death knew of his interest in the case and were not going to leave him alone. A few days later, tragedy struck and this story ended. Jason's house burned to the ground at night while he was inside. Firefighters were unable to save him. The official version was a short circuit, but those who knew what had been going on in Jason's life in recent weeks had no doubt that it was no accident. The story of heroism that began with his selfless act ended in tragedy, but the truth never came out, lost in the ashes of lies and corruption that devoured the lives of those who wanted to fight for justice. Several days had passed since Jason had learned of Officer Carlisle's death. The thought that he had saved the life of a man involved in corruption, only to have him die under mysterious circumstances, had been troubling him, but soon a new shadow had been added to those worries, a topic that Jason had tried to avoid his entire life: racism. When the story of a black man saving a white police officer from a burning car hit the news, Jason became an unwitting hero. The media and social media celebrated his act, portraying it as a symbol of unity and racial harmony, but the admiration soon gave way to something darker. One day, as Jason was driving down the street, he noticed that people were reacting to him differently. At first, it was just strange looks, whispers behind his back, but then anonymous threatening letters started appearing in his mailbox. One of them stuck in his memory: "Forget what you did. People like you shouldn't interfere in white people's affairs." Jason knew that these were echoes of the deep racial issues that still plagued the community. He had grown up in a neighborhood where relations between blacks and the police were tense, often violent. Many of his friends and neighbors had suffered at the hands of police brutality, and even Jason himself had been subjected to unjust stops and searches simply because of the color of his skin. But this was different. He had been the one to save a police officer, and that fact seemed to divide the community more than it united it. One day, as Jason was leaving the store, a strange man approached him. He was dressed in shabby work clothes, and his face expressed a mixture of contempt and hatred. "Hey, hero," the man said angrily, "do you think that after you saved one of them, you're now one of them? Do you think they'll respect you?" Jason tried to leave without causing a conflict, but the man continued following him. "They will never accept you. You were and will remain simply black, no matter how many white people you save." The words cut deeper than Jason would like to admit. Resentment bubbled up inside him. He had done what he thought was right, but his actions were now being used as a weapon to divide, not unite. But everything changed one day when Jason was stopped on the street by two police officers. They were stern and formal. "Are you Jason Harris?" one of them asked. "Yes," Jason replied, trying to understand what was going on. "We have reason to believe that you were involved in the recent riots," said another officer, without waiting for an explanation. It was absurd. Jason had never been involved in a protest or riot, but the police clearly weren't going to listen. They handcuffed him and took him to the station. In the interrogation room, He was met by an officer he hadn't expected to see, the police chief, the same man who had called him after Carlisle's rescue. "How could you?" Jason asked excitedly as the officer entered the room. "We're doing our job," he replied calmly. "Your reputation doesn't matter here. You've gone too far." Jason suddenly realized that his arrest was no accident. It was an attempt to silence him. Rumors of Carlisle's death and his attempt to expose corruption began to surface in the local press, and the authorities were looking for someone to blame. Someone decided that Jason was the perfect candidate to distract attention. "You've been used, Jason," the police chief continued coldly, "and you either play by the rules or you'll end up in the same situation as Carlisle." The chief's words sounded like a threat. Jason realized that his heroism was now just a tool in the hands of a system that continued to live by its racist rules. Saving a white police officer did not make him a hero in the eyes of everyone. For some, he became a traitor. For others, a threat. Jason was released the next day, but the experience forced him to reconsider his views. He could no longer stand by. He saw that racism was not just how people treated each other. It was a system that fed on fear and division. The story of saving the police officer, which at first seemed like a bright moment of unity, was now turning into a tragedy. Jason knew that his role in this story was not over. He could not allow his act to be used to justify injustice. A long and dangerous road lay ahead of him, but now he was ready to fight not only for his life, but also for those who suffer from injustice and racial discrimination every day. After his arrest, Jason could no longer return to his old life. The weight of the injustice he felt was too much to bear. He felt that what had happened to him was not just an accident or a series of unfortunate circumstances, it was the result of a deeply ingrained system that had been weighing on him since birth. But now it was not just his personal tragedy, it was part of something bigger. Saving a white police officer from a fire was initially seen as a rare moment of racial reconciliation, but in reality it only heightened tensions. Jason noticed rumors spreading among his friends and neighbors. Some said he had betrayed his community by saving an officer who had been involved in crimes against them. Others saw him as a symbol of hope, an example that blacks and whites could help each other despite past conflicts. But the reality was more complicated. A couple of days later, in the evening, the same woman, Carlisle's sister, whom he had seen after her brother's death, drove up to Jason's house. There was fear on her face. "Jason, I found out something important," she said, speaking quickly, holding her breath, as if she were afraid she was being followed. "My brother didn't die for nothing." He was about to release documents that showed that the police and local officials were deliberately creating conflict between the black and white communities. Their plan was simple: keep everyone in a constant state of fear and division, so that no one could unite and challenge the system. The words hit Jason like a hammer. Everything he had intuitively felt was true. The system was deliberately sowing discord to weaken resistance, and his heroic act of saving the police officer was part of that larger plan. They wanted to use him as a symbol that all was well, that racial issues were being resolved. But in reality, those in power were just waiting for the right moment to ratchet up the tension again. "I found these documents, Jason," the woman continued, looking around nervously. "My brother gave them to me before he died, and now I know they're being hunted. You have to see them." She handed him a thick folder of papers, and despite his fear, Jason took it. The documents revealed terrible truths. There were reports of covert operations in which police deliberately raided poor areas, provoking violence. There were accounts of how local authorities suppressed protests by stoking hatred between different ethnic groups. It was a deliberate campaign of division. Jason knew he held more than just evidence. He held the key to unmasking the entire system. But the more he read, the more he realized it would be a dangerous path. He was no longer just a man who had saved a police officer. He was a threat to those who had maintained the balance of fear and hatred for decades. A few days after meeting Carlisle's sister, police cars pulled up to Jason's house again. But this time, they weren't there to arrest him. They were there to warn him. Two officers, still wearing sunglasses, knocked on his door. "You're playing with fire, boy," one of them began, hands in his pockets. "We know what you've got. Give us the papers, and we'll forget about it. But if you decide to go against us, we'll make your life a living hell. You know how we do that." Jason was silent, but there was a growing sense within him that this was more than just a choice between life and death. This was a moment of truth. On the one hand, danger and possible destruction awaited him. On the other, a chance to change everything, to break free from the chains that had bound him and his community for decades. He knew he couldn't do it alone. So the next day, Jason went to see an old friend, Marcus, an activist who had long fought for black rights. They hadn't seen each other for several years, but Marcus was the only person he could trust. Jason told him about the documents and that they were coming for him. "This is bigger than you and me, Jason," Marcus said, studying the papers. "This is proof that racism isn't just prejudice. It's an orchestrated system of oppression, but it's also our opportunity. We can bring this to light." They began secretly assembling a team, people who could help spread the word and prepare society for what would happen if the truth came out. There were journalists, independent lawyers, activists, anyone tired of the lies and violence. But the closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more danger surrounded Jason. More than once he noticed that he was being followed. And one day, when he returned home, he found the door broken down and his things turned over. But the documents remained safe. He hid them in a safe place. One night, as he and Marcus were discussing their final move, there was a knock at the door. It was Carlisle's sister, pale and worried. "They're coming for me," she said, breathing heavily. "I don't know how much time we have left." Jason and Marcus knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to act now, before the system could destroy them. Jason, Marcus, and Carlisle's sister, Anna, knew their time was running out. They felt the net tightening around them, and every day could be the last for their mission, but they couldn't back out. The documents Anna gave Jason were proof not only of police corruption, but of a system steeped in racial discrimination and oppression. They spent the night discussing how exactly to release the information. Marcus suggested turning to journalists with independent reputations who would not be afraid to go against the authorities. Anna insisted on handing over the documents to several organizations at once, so that no one could silence them. But everyone knew that the further they went, the higher the stakes became. The very next day, they met with a journalist named Sarah Wilson, who had been covering police brutality and racial discrimination for years. Sarah was known for her often high-profile investigative reporting, but she had been threatened many times for it. Despite the dangers, she agreed to help. The documents Jason gave her shook her to the core. "This could be the biggest revelation in decades," she said quietly, turning the pages. "But you realize that once this comes out, life will never be the same for any of us?" Jason just nodded. He knew this move would be dangerous, but their goal was clear: to destroy a system that used racism as a tool of control. Despite all the precautions they took, the threats continued to mount. One night, walking home late at night, Jason noticed a car following him slowly down the street. He quickened his pace, trying to get away, but suddenly a deafening shot rang out. The bullet passed just inches from him, slamming into a brick wall. Jason began to run, knowing he couldn't stop. Those pursuing him were no longer hiding their intentions. The next day Anna came to him. She was excited. Her eyes were red from tears. "Marcus is missing," she said, her voice shaking. "No one has seen him since last night. I tried calling him, but his phone is off." The news hit Jason like a bolt from the blue. Marcus, his trusted friend, the one who had supported him from the start, was missing. There was no doubt that the very forces they were trying to expose were behind it. Jason knew his friend might never return. The next morning brought more terrible news. Marcus's house had been found burned to the ground, and the news reported an accident involving a gas leak. But Jason knew it was no accident. Marcus had been a victim of the same system they were fighting against. He had been killed to silence him. Shocked by grief and guilt, Jason met Sarah again. Now there was no doubt that they were fighting against something huge and all-powerful. "I can't stop, Jason," Sarah said firmly, seeing his doubts. "If we retreat now, their victory will be final. We must reveal everything. For Marcus, for Carlisle, for those who suffered and remained silent all these years." Jason knew she was right, but now he was more afraid than ever. Marcus's death was a reminder that the system wasn't just protecting its own interests, it was ruthlessly destroying anyone who threatened its existence. Meanwhile, the city streets became a zone of open hostility. Tensions between black and white communities, skillfully maintained by the authorities for years, began to explode. Protests became more frequent, escalating into clashes with the police. Those who had once considered Jason a hero now viewed him with suspicion. Some accused him of making the situation worse, others of betraying his community by saving a white police officer. But the bitterest truth came when Jason learned of the so-called racial plan, a secret document that was part of the very corruption he was trying to expose. The plan was to divide and suppress different ethnic groups by fomenting hatred between them. The more violence there was between blacks and whites, the more powerful those behind the system became. People feared each other more than they feared power itself, and in this fear they lost the ability to see the real enemy. The document Anna gave Jason contained direct evidence of this plan. It clearly described how high-ranking officials, police officers, and corporate structures used racial tensions to strengthen their positions. It was a deliberate tactic: more fear, more control. But now the plan was in the hands of Jason and Sarah. They had to decide how to proceed. Jason knew that publishing these documents could provoke not just a scandal, but a real war on the streets of the city. White police and black communities, pushed to the brink, could explode into even greater violence. Despite her fear, Sarah published the first part of the materials. The article was titled, "Racial Manipulation: How the Authorities Play on Hatred." It detailed a scheme aimed at inciting racial hatred. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The protests intensified, and the authorities began to vigorously deny the accusations, calling them a conspiracy theory. The next day, Jason returned home to find the words "traitor" written in red on his door. He knew he was now considered an enemy of both those he had tried to save and those he had exposed. But the worst thing happened a few days later. Anna disappeared. At first, Jason thought she was just hiding, fearing for her life, but then her body was found in the woods on the outskirts of town. She had been beaten to death. The local police again wrote it off as an accident, but Jason knew the truth. Anna's death was the final warning. The deaths of his friends, the constant threats and the growing violence on the streets have turned Jason's life into a nightmare. What started as an act of heroism, saving a life, has now become his curse. After Anna's death, Jason was overcome with grief and guilt. Her death was the final blow in a series of tragedies unfolding around him. People he trusted and who had become part of his fight for the truth disappeared one by one, leaving him alone in a growing chaos. The city was falling into darkness. Protests that had begun as peaceful marches for justice were now turning violent. Police cars were burning in the streets, and police were responding with brutality in crowds. Everything that had been promised, justice, equality, now seemed an illusion. Instead, racial tensions were boiling over. The documents Sarah released revealed a shocking truth, but with that knowledge came more violence. Everyone could now see that they had been manipulated, that their hatred for each other was the result of an elaborate system. Whites and blacks began to blame each other even more. For many, as tragic as it may sound, the revelations were further proof that racial barriers were insurmountable. The powers they were exposing were struggling to hold on, using the media to discredit Jason and those who supported him. One channel ran the headlines, "Race War in the City, Jason Harris, Provocateur or Traitor." The police said the revelations were staged and the materials fabricated to undermine authority. Anything that could have led to unity was turned back into hostility. One night, Jason was forced to leave his home. The city had become a trap for him. Every street was filled with hatred, and the words "traitor" were increasingly appearing on the walls of houses. The people who had once supported him now turned away, believing that he had only added fuel to the fire. There was no longer any safety or peace. In despair and with no faith in the system, Jason hid in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. There he met Sarah. She looked exhausted. Her eyes, which once burned with a thirst for justice, were now filled with anxiety. "They're going to destroy us soon, Jason," she said, holding the phone with trembling hands, where she received threats day after day. "We've already lost Marcus. Anna, I don't know how much longer we can hold out, but if we retreat now, it will mean they have won." Jason replied quietly, "All this death, all this pain, it will be in vain. We must go on to the end, no matter how terrible it is." But Sarah remained silent. She knew Jason was right, but she also knew that her chances of winning were slim. Too many forces were united against them. And yet, they decided to take the final step. With the last of their resources, they prepared a final revelation, a series of videos and audio recordings that backed up all their accusations. These recordings left no doubt about the existence of a racial plan, and if they were released to the public, even the authorities would not be able to deny it. They agreed to hand the materials over to a well-known international journalist who was willing to take risks for the truth. He agreed to publish everything on major news platforms, which would guarantee the information would spread, but this move was incredibly dangerous. The next morning, when Jason and Sarah were supposed to meet a journalist, they felt like they were being followed. As they stepped outside to head to the meeting point, a black, unmarked car turned the corner. Jason froze in place when he saw the car slowly pull up in front of them. "Sarah," he said quietly, "let's run." They began to run through the narrow streets, feeling the unknown people following them. Jason's heart was pounding in his chest. They knew that if they were caught, all evidence would be gone forever. But suddenly there was the sound of tires screeching and a gunshot. Sarah screamed and fell to the ground, clutching her side. Jason stopped, horrified, his body frozen in fear. He saw blood begin to seep through her fingers. "No, no, Sarah, hold on," he shouted, rushing towards her. She tried to speak, but her voice became quieter and quieter. "Jason, the documents, give them the truth." But Jason knew time was short. He could hear footsteps approaching, and he had no choice. He lifted her body into his arms and began to run, but he saw the light around him fading. The hunt was on. He managed to take refuge in an abandoned apartment on the outskirts of the city. There he found Sarah unconscious, and blood soaked his clothes. He tried to stop the bleeding, but he knew it was the end. Her life was fading right before his eyes. I'm sorry I dragged you into this," Jason whispered, realizing he was losing his last ally. She didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was barely audible. The death of another loved one had broken Jason completely. He was alone. The entire city had become a hostile zone, and those who were supposed to protect him were now his enemies. But the worst thing was that Sarah's death was another victim in this endless chain of racial hatred that he was trying to break. Jason began to doubt that he could change anything. The system was too strong. The next day he received a message. It was from the same journalist to whom they were going to hand over the documents. "I got the material. Now it's all up to me. We'll see this through to the end." But even that ray of hope couldn't overshadow what Jason had lost. Sarah's death had become a symbol for him that the fight against racism, systemic oppression, and injustice is a battle in which there will always be victims. And even though the whistleblower was on the verge of success, Jason knew the price he had paid was too high. The tragedy that unfolded around him showed him that sometimes victory does not come to those who begin the fight. Sometimes those who try to change the system die without ever seeing the fruits of their struggle. After Sarah's death, Jason felt like his life had completely fallen apart. The city was plunged into violence, and his own actions had only made it worse. The documents and information they had collected became his only legacy. He remained in an abandoned apartment, hiding from his pursuers and waiting for it all to end. One day, when Jason was thinking about what to do next, an old friend named Tony, whom he had not seen for many years, suddenly showed up at the door of his hideout. Tony was one of the few people Jason could call a true friend. "Jason, I knew you were in trouble, but I didn't think it was this bad," Tony said, looking around the apartment. "We thought you were missing. What happened?" Jason was shocked by Tony's appearance. They hugged, and Jason began to tell about what had happened, the revelations, the threats, the death of friends. Tony listened to him silently, without interrupting. "You're not the only one suffering," Tony said when Jason finished. "I'm in this too. Our paths crossed for a reason, but there's something I want to show you." Tony pulled the tablet out of his pocket and turned it on. The screen displayed images and documents that Jason had seen before. But there was something new, a video recording taken at a police station. Jason recognized the people in the recording, high-ranking officials and police officers he had heard about in his investigations. They were discussing how to use the situation to manipulate public opinion and how to eliminate those who posed a threat to their power. "This is real evidence of corruption that they can't refute," Tony said. "I've been working on this for months, but I've managed to hide it from their eyes. Now we have a chance. We can do more than just expose it." Jason was stunned. What he thought was the final step was actually part of a much larger scheme. This evidence could change the entire game, expose the entire system. But it was on the verge of being exposed, and it was life-threatening. "How did you find them?" Jason asked, trying to process the new information. "A group of my colleagues and I were able to hack into their servers and find these records," Tony replied, "but we haven't released them to the public yet. It's too risky. We need to know how to use this data properly." They agreed to meet with some trusted journalists and human rights organizations who could help spread the word. Together with Tony and a group of activists, they organized an emergency meeting in a secluded location to discuss strategy. Meanwhile, Jason began receiving anonymous threatening messages. The messages became more aggressive and personalized, hinting that they knew where he was and what he was planning. His fear for his own life grew into the realization that he was part of not just a personal tragedy, but a global fight for truth. One night, while Jason and Tony were meeting with a team of journalists, their hideout was discovered. The police, acting on a tip-off, descended on their location and a brutal takedown operation began. Jason and Tony managed to escape into the underground tunnels, but they were joined by a group of people, including an old acquaintance of Jason's, Kevin, a former police officer who had once left the force after witnessing abuse. Kevin, to Jason's surprise, was part of a group that was also trying to expose corruption. His appearance was a surprise. He explained that he had been continuing his own investigation, and after learning about Jason, he decided to help. "They know we're onto them," Kevin said, looking around, "but we're not alone. There are people inside the system who want change. They can help us if we pitch it right." Kevin suggested contacting a group of rebel police officers and officials who were willing to support them, as well as some influential figures who could put pressure on the authorities. Jason and Tony, having no other choice, agreed. All this time, Jason and his team were hiding and preparing their attack. They thought through every step, planned how to transfer the data and how to ensure its safety. Tensions reached their peak when they learned that the authorities were preparing a large-scale operation to arrest everyone involved in the exposure. Eventually, they found a way to hand over key evidence to several international human rights organizations and media outlets. The world community was shocked. The hidden truth was exposed, and a massive international reaction began. Investigations were conducted. Many high-ranking officials were forced to resign, and serious reform began in the country. Jason, unfortunately, did not live to see his full triumph. His struggle continued until the end, and he was forced to hide until the very end. He saw only parts of how his sacrifice led to change, but he understood that his actions helped to find hope and change the situation. Tony and Kevin continued their work, drawing on the evidence they had gathered and the support of international organizations, to bring justice to those harmed by the system and to help bring about reform. Jason's story became a symbol of the fight for truth and justice, showing that sometimes change comes at the highest price, but its influence lived on, inspiring others to fight for a better future despite all the hardships and tragedies. After the international community began to react to the revelations, Jason remained in hiding, but he never gave up hope that his fight would bring about real change. While the focus was on international reactions and reforms, Jason considered his next steps. His trusted people, like Tony and Kevin, kept him on his toes and continued to work to make the revelations have as big an impact as possible. One night, while Jason was in his new hideout, his phone suddenly rang. He was surprised to find a letter from an unknown sender, which contained information about an upcoming important event, a closed meeting of high-ranking officials and businessmen, where further actions to suppress the consequences of the exposure were planned. This meeting could have included key figures who could influence the course of reform. Jason knew that this could be the last chance to expose the depth of corruption and manipulation. With the help of Tony and Kevin, Jason began planning how to infiltrate the meeting. Their plan was complex and risky, but they knew it was the only way to finally expose those who were trying to maintain power. On the night of the meeting, Jason, Tony, and Kevin, dressed in business suits, entered the building where the event was taking place. They used fake IDs and disguises to get past security and into the room. The secret meeting was held in a luxurious room filled with high-profile people Jason had previously seen in exposed materials. Jason soon noticed several familiar faces among the attendees, indicating that this meeting was not just a closed event, but a real strategy meeting to plan the next steps. As Jason and his team searched for a way to record the discussions, they saw several people begin sharing plans to suppress protests, tighten control over the media, and even rig the upcoming election. That was all Jason wanted to capture. But as the meeting progressed, security began to suspect the presence of outsiders. Jason and his team realized that their time was running out. They needed to find a way to obtain the necessary evidence and quickly leave the building. At the last moment, Tony managed to record some of the discussions on a hidden camera. They decided to use their knowledge of the building's internal structure to find a way out. However, when they tried to leave, security was already on their trail. A chase ensued through the corridors, and Jason felt the tension reach its breaking point. They managed to reach the outside of the building and hide in the park, where a prepared transport was waiting for them. However, Kevin was wounded during the escape. Jason and Tony managed to evacuate, but Kevin was taken to the hospital. His condition was serious and his life was in danger. Meanwhile, the information Tony had recorded was leaked to international news agencies. This new evidence, confirming the plans for manipulation and suppression, caused a new wave of public outrage. The pressure on the authorities became unbearable. Amid all this, Jason discovered an unexpected twist. One of the reports published after the leak mentioned that some of the top officials were planning not only to suppress the fallout from the revelations, but to use it as a tool to consolidate their power by posing as reformers. This meant that they were trying to use public outrage to their advantage, to manipulate society and avoid real change. To uncover this plan, Jason turned to a powerful analyst who, to his surprise, was willing to help him expose it. The analyst, Caitlin Hart, was known for her bold investigations and willingness to take risks for the truth. Caitlin and her team worked to expose the new manipulation and prevent the reforms from being rigged. Meanwhile, Jason remained in hiding, taking precautions to stay under the radar of authorities. He still felt guilty about the death and suffering his actions had caused to his loved ones, but he knew his struggle was part of something bigger. Caitlin, having analyzed the new data, prepared a series of articles and reports that finally destroyed the plans of the manipulators. These materials exposed how the authorities tried to use public discontent to strengthen their positions, and not for real reforms. In the midst of all this, Jason received a message from Tony. Kevin, despite serious injuries, was surviving and recovering. Jason was grateful that his friend was alive, albeit injured. Over time, public pressure on the government became unbearable. Reforms were introduced that began to change the system. Even if the changes were insufficient and the process was far from ideal, Jason and his team managed to achieve significant results. Jason's story became an important part of the fight for justice. His sacrifices were not in vain. Although he remained in the shadows, his actions and those who supported him led to the beginning of change. Jason knew that his mission was far from complete, and that the fight for truth and justice would continue. But he also understood that every victory, every change, even if it came with pain and loss, was a step toward a better future. After Jason and his team exposed the government's manipulations and received widespread international support, it seemed that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Reforms were being implemented, and public opinion was changing rapidly. But despite the visible changes, the hidden threat remained. Jason and his team knew that the fight was not over. Jason remained in hiding, feeling that his actions had made a significant difference, but not all of the consequences were clear. Each victory brought new challenges and dangers. At times, he faced inner demons that haunted him, guilt for his losses, and fear that his actions could lead to tragedy again. Sarah, Kevin, and the others were victims of his struggle. Jason could not forget their sacrifices, and it did not allow him to relax. He was aware that the system they were trying to destroy would not go down without a fight. One day, Jason received information about a new wave of repression that had begun in the city. The government tried to use the reforms as cover for a brutal purge against those who were allegedly connected to the protests and revelations. Under the guise of reforms, the authorities began arresting and persecuting activists, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who spoke out against the regime. When Jason learned of this, he knew he had to act quickly. Together with Tony, Caitlin, and the rest of his trusted people, they began gathering evidence of further abuse. Caitlin, despite her dedication to the cause, faced increasing pressure and threats. She was stalked and under constant threat. One day, when Jason was meeting with Caitlin in a safe house, she came with new information that could be the key to exposing the ongoing crackdown. But during the meeting, their safe house was attacked. Caitlin managed to give Jason important documents, but she was seriously injured in the attack. Jason and Tony managed to escape, but their fate was again in jeopardy. Caitlin was hospitalized and her condition was critical. Jason felt that all their efforts could be in vain if they failed to finish the job. The documents Caitlin handed over contained evidence of a new wave of repression orchestrated by the government under the guise of reform. The evidence showed how the government was using its power to create false charges and suppress any resistance. Jason and Tony worked to prepare the materials for publication, but time was running out. Caitlin, despite her grave condition, remained conscious and continued to fight for the truth. She was able to personally ensure that the materials she had handed over would be published, and her final words were full of determination. "We can't stop now, Jason. The truth must be heard." Jason and Tony turned to international human rights organizations and the media, who were already aware of the situation. They were able to quickly organize a press conference and publish revelations that caused another public outcry. The authorities were forced to admit their actions under pressure from the international community. As public attention returned to the crisis, Jason continued to remain in the shadows. He learned that authorities were actively searching for anyone involved in the revelations, and even his old allies were under threat. Caitlin, despite her determination, did not survive her wounds. She was one of those who made the final sacrifice in the fight for justice. Her death left Jason with a deep sense of loss, but also with the determination to continue her legacy. He knew that her sacrifice was not in vain and that their fight had truly made a difference. The new crackdowns were halted, and human rights activists began working to ensure that those who had suffered under the system were protected. But amid all this, Jason felt that his personal mission was not yet complete. He decided to use his knowledge and resources to continue the fight for justice, but now more carefully and strategically. Jason knew that his actions were part of a larger fight for human rights and democracy. Despite everything he had been through, Jason began to see light at the end of the tunnel. The reforms were beginning to bear fruit, and public opinion was changing, but he also knew that the fight was not over, and that there was still much work to be done. With each new step, Jason continued to move forward, hoping that his sacrifice and the sacrifices of his friends would become the basis for real change. Jason's story has become a symbol of the fight for truth and justice, showing that despite personal tragedies and losses, true victory lies in the ongoing fight for a better future for all. After Caitlin's death and incredible sacrifice, Jason and Tony continued to fight, knowing they stood on the brink of success in another crisis. Caitlin was more than just a colleague, she was a friend and a symbol of hope. They knew they had to preserve her legacy and continue her work. Jason and Tony moved into a new phase of their work, focusing their efforts on long-term change. They began coordinating with international human rights organizations to create a platform to continue the fight for human rights and freedom of speech. They understood that simply exposing corruption was not enough. They needed to create a sustainable system that would prevent similar abuses from happening again. Meanwhile, the government tried to restore its image. They announced new policy changes and launched PR campaigns to portray themselves as reformers. But Jason and Tony knew that this was just an attempt to hide the real problems. They continued to monitor the government's actions and identify any attempts at manipulation. One day, Jason received an anonymous message that contained information about an upcoming closed meeting of high-ranking officials and businessmen. This meeting was planned as a strategic meeting to discuss new measures that would strengthen the power of the existing regime and suppress the remnants of the protest movement. Jason, Tony and their team decided to use this information to create another major expose. They knew it was risky, but they knew that without this data they would not be able to fully expose the government's true goals. This time, they couldn't rely on a simple infiltration. They organized a strategic operation that included a cyber attack on the security system of the building where the meeting was held. Caitlin, even from the hospital, remained active and helped them coordinate the actions through her colleagues. The operation was successful, and they were able to gain access to internal communications and meeting recordings. These materials contained a wealth of evidence of how the government planned to manipulate public opinion, using private companies and media to increase control and suppress independent opinion. But not everything went according to plan. While preparing for publication, Jason discovered that someone was trying to hack their servers and destroy data. They became the target of constant cyber attacks and spying operations, which created a huge security risk for the entire team. Jason and Tony worked around the clock to protect the data and ensure it was in safe hands. They were able to connect with international cybersecurity organizations that provided them with the protection and assistance they needed. On the eve of publication, Jason and Tony received news that their main enemies, the government and its allies, had launched a massive smear campaign. They launched false accusations against Jason and his team, trying to portray them as terrorists and criminals. The campaign became so aggressive that Jason and Tony began to fear for their lives. One day, while Jason was in hiding, he received a message from an old acquaintance, a former colleague from his time in the police. This man said that he had information that a large-scale operation was being planned to eliminate everyone involved in the revelations. Their lives were in danger. In response, Jason and Tony decided to act quickly. They arranged an emergency meeting with human rights activists and international journalists to hand over the latest evidence and publish it in the world's major media outlets. The publication came at a time when public opinion was at its breaking point, and news of cyber attacks and false accusations captured the attention of the entire planet. The reaction was immediate. The authorities began to face internal pressure. Their political base began to crumble. Large-scale protests swept the country, and the international community increased its demands for real reform. This pressure led to significant changes that began to be implemented in the country. Jason, despite all his successes, felt that his fight was not over. There was a threat that the authorities would try to regain control using old methods. He continued to work in the shadows, collaborating with human rights groups and activists. As a result, Jason and his team were able to create a sustainable network for the protection of human rights and freedom of speech. Their work not only led to significant reforms in the country, but also became a model for other countries where movements for change were also beginning. Jason, in the shadows, knew that their struggle had left a deep mark on history. He saw how change was beginning to impact the lives of ordinary people, and it gave him satisfaction. Despite the personal sacrifice and loss, he knew that his actions had helped bring hope and change. Jason's story became a testament to the power of fighting for truth, perseverance and sacrifice. It showed that even in the darkest circumstances, you can find light and change the world for the better. Every step, every effort, every overcoming of difficulties became part of a great journey towards justice, which continued and will continue, inspiring new generations to fight for truth and justice. Following the revelations and public outcry, Jason and his team had made significant progress in the fight against corruption and manipulation. However, their mission was not over. Despite the reforms, issues of racism and social injustice continued to be relevant, and Jason knew that these issues required a new approach and continued attention. Over time, it became clear that the authorities, although forced to carry out reforms, had not changed their true intentions. A new wave of racist propaganda began in the country. which was used to manipulate public opinion and create new sources of tension. The forces interested in preserving the old order began to use racism as a tool to split society and distract attention from real problems. Jason and Tony noticed that racist groups and radical movements were gaining strength. They organized meetings with various activist groups and human rights organizations to discuss strategies to combat racism and prevent violence. One of the key points in their new strategy was to create a youth education and awareness program. Jason and his team began working on a project that aimed to bring the truth to the younger generation about racism, discrimination, and the importance of equality. They developed educational materials and organized events aimed at educating and actively engaging young people in the fight against bias and stereotypes. At an anti-racism event, Jason met a young activist named Alex. Alex was an inspiring speaker and leader in his community, but his work had also attracted the attention of radical groups who began threatening him and his family. Jason and Tony decided to support Alex and provide him with protection. Alex shared with them information that radical groups had received support from certain political forces interested in fueling racial conflicts. These forces tried to create the appearance that reforms and efforts to combat racism were ineffective, and that the only solution was increased repression. Jason and Tony decided they needed to take action. They joined forces with Alex and other activists to organize mass protests and campaigns to denounce racist groups and political manipulation. They also began investigating how political elites were using racism to achieve their goals, and uncovered connections between radical groups and high-profile political figures. The process was difficult and full of obstacles. In response to their actions, radical groups increased their aggression, leading to clashes in the streets and on social media. Jason and his team faced constant threats and violence, but their determination to stay in the fight was unwavering. During one of the most tense moments, when protests and clashes reached their peak, Jason and Tony received information about a planned attack on one of the key organizations working to combat racism. They quickly organized an operation to protect the organization and prevent the attack. As a result, violence was avoided, but the pressure on Jason and his team increased. Jason soon learned that his actions had attracted international attention, and human rights organizations began to actively support their efforts. They received funding and resources to conduct larger campaigns and continue their education programs. This helped strengthen their position and provide additional protection. After months of hard work and organizing mass protests, Jason and his team reached a major milestone. They secured the passage of a bill that aimed to combat systemic racism and discrimination. The bill included measures to improve education, strengthen legal protections for victims of racism, and create independent commissions to investigate cases of racial discrimination. But amid these victories, a new tragedy came. As a result of another attack by radical groups, Alex was fatally shot. His death caused a huge wave of anger and sadness among activists and the community. Alex was a symbol of struggle and inspiration for many, and his loss left a deep wound in the hearts of all who knew him. Saying goodbye to Alex was a moment of deep reflection for Jason and his team. They decided to continue the fight in his honor, trying to finish the job and do everything they could to make a real difference. Ultimately, the work of Jason and his team led to significant changes in society. Bills, programs, and educational initiatives began to show results. Public opinion began to change, and a new generation became more aware and active in the fight against racism and discrimination. Jason, despite his personal loss and suffering, found solace in the fact that his efforts and sacrifices helped change the world for the better. His work, though not completely finished, left an important legacy. The story of Jason and his team became an example of how courage and determination can lead to change despite all the difficulties and tragedies. In his final phase of work, Jason focused on mentoring and supporting new activists, aiming to pass on his experience and knowledge to the next generation. He continued to work behind the scenes, helping to organize events and campaigns aimed at maintaining progress in the fight for equality and justice. Jason's story remains a living testament to the fight for truth and equality. His life and work continue to inspire many to take action and support justice. Ultimately, Jason knew that despite all the hardships, his efforts had led to the world becoming a little better, and that was his greatest victory. As Jason and his team began celebrating their recent accomplishments and planning their next steps in the fight for equality, they encountered an unexpected turn of events. One night, while Jason was going through his emails, he found an anonymous message with a link to a video. The video was short, but its content was shocking. In the recording, Jason saw a prominent political figure discussing plans to create a new program aimed at increasing control over social movements amidst celebrations of the reforms. What most alarmed Jason was that the video included details about the creation of fake protest groups that would demonstrate non-existent resistance to the reforms and use this as an excuse for repression. Jason immediately realized that this information was critical to their fight. He quickly contacted Tony and other team members to discuss how this revelation could be used. They decided to investigate and confirm the veracity of the information. As Jason and Tony worked on this, they noticed that their surroundings were becoming increasingly tense. Strange things began to happen. Their phones were being tapped, and their actions seemed to be known to someone. At the same time, rumors began to circulate about a new influential activist who claimed that his organization was fighting for reform, but whose methods and ideas seemed suspicious. The solution came when Jason and Tony discovered that the activist was actually a frontman created by government agencies to manipulate public opinion. He was a tool for manipulation and confusion. His goal was not only to divert attention from the real issues, but also to discredit the real activists. It suddenly became clear that this activist was part of a complex scheme to create internal divisions among protesters and activists. Security services and secret agents worked to infiltrate the opposition, sowing distrust and suspicion. As Jason and his team continued their investigation, they became the target of a new activist and his support groups. The campaign began to gain momentum, and Jason found himself and Tony being targeted not only on social media, but in real life. Their homes were broken into, and their personal information was leaked. Things got worse when one day Jason received a message from an unknown informant offering information about a major event that was going to happen. Jason and Tony decided to take on the challenge and expose government manipulation at the highest levels. When they arrived at the scene, they found it to be a gathering of high-profile politicians and businessmen who were going to discuss plans to manage social unrest. Jason noticed several people in attendance who were connected to radical groups and front activists. He realized that this was a strategic meeting to coordinate further actions to suppress the real protest movement. In the midst of the meeting, Jason and Tony attempted to enter the meeting room to obtain evidence, but as soon as they entered the building, their actions were noticed. A race ensued, and Jason realized they were trapped. He and Tony found themselves surrounded by security, and their attempts to leave the building were thwarted. In a dire situation, Jason was able to steal several critical documents before they were captured. The documents contained information on how the government planned to use manipulation and falsification to make them appear to be against reform and gain additional powers. These documents were handed over to international organizations, which caused a new wave of pressure on the authorities. Despite the danger, Jason and Tony were able to pass important evidence to the media and human rights organizations. Soon after the information was released, mass protests and international condemnation began. The authorities came under pressure, and investigations into manipulation and high-level corruption began. This new wave of public anger put the government back in a difficult position, and the beginning of real change became more likely. Despite these successes, Jason and Tony continued to remain in the shadows, fearing for their safety. They understood that the real victory was to preserve freedom and continue working to improve society. Jason's story showed that in a world of politics and manipulation, there is no room for complacency, but courage and determination can open new horizons for justice and equality. Following the revelations and public outcry, Jason and his team had made significant progress in the fight against corruption and manipulation. However, their mission was not over. Despite the reforms, issues of racism and social injustice continued to be relevant, and Jason knew that these issues required a new approach and continued attention. Soon after their documents became the basis for international pressure on the authorities, Jason noticed that public attention began to focus on their activities. However, this attention had a downside. They became a target for hostile forces interested in their elimination. One night, Jason discovered an anonymous message with a link to a video. In the recording, he saw a well-known political figure discussing plans to create a new program aimed at increasing control over social movements. Jason immediately realized that this information was critical to their fight. He quickly contacted Tony and other members of the team to discuss how this revelation could be used. They decided to investigate and confirm the veracity of the information. As Jason and Tony worked on this, they noticed that their surroundings were becoming increasingly tense. Strange things began to happen, their phones were being tapped, and their actions seemed to be known to someone. At the same time, rumors began to circulate about a new influential activist who claimed that his organization was fighting for reform, but whose methods and ideas seemed suspicious. The solution came when Jason and Tony discovered that the activist was actually a frontman created by government agencies to manipulate public opinion. He was a tool for manipulation and confusion. His goal was not only to divert attention from the real issues, but also to discredit the real activists. It suddenly became clear that this activist was part of a complex scheme to create internal divisions among protesters and activists. Security services and secret agents worked to infiltrate the opposition, sowing distrust and suspicion. As Jason and Tony continued their investigation, they became the target of new attacks. The press and the internet became full of accusations against them, portraying them as malevolent actors trying to undermine the stability of the country. These attacks came from both radical groups and government officials, and they were very effective in creating public discontent. The scariest thing was that this time their actions led to violence. During one of the street protests in support of reforms, provoked by fake news, a tragic incident occurred. Several civilians died in the clashes. The culprits were quickly identified as provocateurs working for radical groups, but public opinion had already been severely undermined. Jason and Tony found themselves in the middle of a crisis. With violence and accusations mounting, they knew they had to do something to regain the public's trust. They held an emergency press conference and released new evidence of manipulation and sting operations to set the record straight. As a result of these efforts, Jason, Tony, and Lena were able to achieve another round of public pressure. However, at this point, something unexpected happened. Internal disagreements in the government led to open conflicts among high-profile politicians. Authorities began publicly accusing each other of corruption and manipulation, which led to political instability. The unexpected turn came when a key figure in the government who had been in opposition to the current regime offered a deal. She was willing to support real reforms and provide protection guarantees for activists in exchange for the public exposure and resignation of her political opponents. The proposal resulted in an unprecedented deal. Public admissions of manipulation and forgery were made, and politicians who supported corruption were indicted. The new government that replaced the old regime began to implement real reforms and take action against racism and discrimination. The struggle left Jason and his team as heroes, but they also knew the cost of their success. Jason, Tony, and Lena continued to work in the new environment, helping to develop programs to create lasting change and prevent similar problems from happening again. Jason and his team's story became an example of how the fight for justice can lead to real change. Despite all the difficulties and betrayals, they became symbols of courage and determination in the pursuit of justice. Despite all the difficulties and dangers, their story not only testified to the strength of the human spirit, but also reminded that even in the darkest times, light and hope can be found, and that real change is possible if you fight for the truth and do not give up. With the political crisis over and reforms in place, it seemed Jason and his team could relax and enjoy the fruits of their labor. However, their lives remained stressful, and new challenges were just around the corner. After the successful completion of the reforms, Jason and Tony returned to their main activities, trying to consolidate the new political system and support its implementation, but they soon noticed that the radical elements, suppressed for a time, began to re-emerge. The new government faced the growth of extremist groups, which began to attack supporters of the reforms and activists. One night, Jason received terrible news. His old friend and comrade, Alex, who had been the victim of violence at the beginning of their struggle, was not just a victim, but a target for further attacks. Caught in the middle of a new conflict, Alex was attacked again. and this time there was no way to save him. His death became a symbol of the ongoing struggle and a tragic reminder that even after victory, problems do not go away. At this time, internal conflicts began to surface among the reformists. Jason and Tony faced growing divisions among their team and allies. Some of them lacked the patience and determination to continue the fight, especially when old problems began to resurface. Political and social pressures increased, and old enemies used every opportunity to undermine their efforts. Their closest ally, Lena, was also under threat. As a result of numerous threats and attacks on her reputation, Lena was forced to withdraw from the public sphere. Jason and Tony understood that her loss was not only a personal tragedy, but also a blow to their fight, as she was an important link in their activities. The most serious blow came when an explosion occurred during one of the public demonstrations in support of reform. The place where the demonstration was taking place turned out to be mined. Jason and Tony miraculously escaped serious injuries, but many of their supporters were killed or injured. The explosion caused a public upheaval and returned the country to the state from which it had only just begun to emerge. In the aftermath of the attack, reports began to emerge that the bombing was not only orchestrated by radical groups, but also possibly supported by hidden elements within the system itself, attempting to return the country to the old ways. Jason and Tony uncovered evidence that several political figures who publicly supported reform were secretly funding extremist groups to create chaos and discredit them. In the context of growing social tension and constant threat, Jason and Tony decided to take matters into their own hands. They conducted their own investigation and collected convincing evidence of the connection between political figures and radical groups. With this evidence, they turned to international human rights organizations and the media. This time, however, their exposure led to even greater conflict. Dangerous groups began hunting for Jason and Tony, with violence and threats escalating. Jason and Tony were forced to hide and operate from the shadows. Their jobs were in jeopardy, and they began to feel that their efforts might be turned against them. Despite all the difficulties, Jason and Tony continued their fight. Eventually, they were able to organize a press conference with the help of their remaining allies and international organizations, providing definitive evidence of corrupt connections and extremist operations. However, at the most critical moment, when it seemed that everything would be revealed, Jason received a threatening letter. The letter said that if they did not stop their actions, their lives and the lives of their loved ones would be in danger. This added personal fear and pressure, but also gave Jason the determination to fight to the end. As a result of subsequent revelations and public pressure, several high-profile politicians were arrested and new investigations were launched. But Jason and Tony, despite their best efforts, continued to live in constant danger, knowing that their struggle and personal lives were at risk. Jason's story was a testament to how the fight for justice can be dangerous and difficult. Their determination and courage inspired many, but also served as a reminder that true change requires constant struggle, and that even after significant victories, new challenges and dangers may arise. After months of struggle, betrayal and threats, Jason and Tony finally felt their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. The wonderful prospect of change and the opportunity to complete their work with satisfaction became a reality for them. As the new round of reforms and investigations reached its peak, the authorities, under pressure and revelations, began to take real steps to restore trust and create a fair society. After arresting key figures involved in corruption and manipulation, the new government focused on strengthening institutions and promoting social justice. Jason and Tony, despite everything they had experienced, were able to return to their work, but now in a different context. They began developing and implementing educational programs aimed at combating racism and discrimination. They also helped create new institutions that worked to support human rights initiatives and ensure justice for all. Over time, Jason and Tony found a way to enjoy their personal lives again. Their efforts to fight for justice led to the creation of strong bonds with new allies and friends. They regained peace and stability, and their work became an inspiration to many. One of the most significant moments of their new life was the opening of a center named after Alex, their fallen friend. The center became a symbol of remembrance and hope, providing resources and support to those who continue to fight for justice and equality. This initiative was an important step in reconciliation and the restoration of a social fabric torn apart by violence and corruption. The new reform course and the efforts of Jason and Tony have led to significant changes in society. The evidence of their struggle and dedication has reached a wide audience. They have received recognition from international organizations and human rights groups for their determination and dedication. Thanks to their work, the government began implementing programs to improve social policy, increase transparency, and combat systemic bias. These changes not only helped improve living conditions for many, but also gave people hope for a better future. One day, Jason and Tony, enjoying a well-earned break, met at a conference where they discussed the results of reforms and their impact on society. At this event, they were pleased to see how their work inspired and supported a whole new generation of activists and human rights defenders. In the midst of this new phase in their lives, they were able to celebrate the achievements of their team and all those who had helped them in their struggle. Their efforts had brought not only changes in politics and society, but also personal satisfaction and joy that their efforts had not been in vain. Now Jason and Tony enjoyed a quiet life, knowing that they had contributed to a better world. They continued their work, but no longer in the shadows or under constant threat. Instead, they became active participants in the process of building a new society full of hope and justice. The story of Jason and Tony ended not only as a triumph of truth and justice, but also as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Their journey was full of hardships and trials, but in the end they were able to achieve the peace and harmony they had strived to create. This story left a deep mark on the hearts of many and became an inspiration for future generations. Thank you for watching this gripping story to the end. We hope it evoked strong emotions in you and made you think about how complex and multi-layered real battles for justice can be. Now we are very interested to know your opinion. How would you act in Jason and Tony's place? What steps would you take in their situation? Write your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. It is important for us to know how you perceive the story and what ideas or suggestions you have. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new exciting videos and continuations of interesting stories. We are glad that you are with us, and we promise to continue to delight you with quality content.